Traiman, CEO and Jerusalem Bureau Chief at the Jewish News Syndicate, to discuss all of the developments here and a lot more. Alex, as always, thank you so much for being here with us.
Josh, thanks for having me.
All right, so first off, do want to talk about this conversation between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. Explain to me your thoughts overall and what you make of the statement by President Trump that the two are on the same side of every issue.
Well, first and foremost is that the two leaders from both countries should be putting forward a public front that they are on the same side of every issue. Unlike the previous administration, all of the disagreements that were taking place between the leaders were being leaked to the press or coming out in public or being stated even by members of the Biden administration that they had disagreements with the Netanyahu administration. So it's clear that always that there might be differences of thinking between the two administrations, but they keep those differences behind closed doors. And it's very important when fighting a war against enemies that you remain united in your front, that people should not anticipate that there's any daylight between the United States and the state of Israel.
And on that note, we do know that, according to the White House, President Trump will visit Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates in mid-May. But as of right now, Israel is not on that itinerary. So what do you make of that? Do you think that that trip could be added? And does that say anything about the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu?
Well, Netanyahu has already visited Trump in the Oval Office 2 times, more than any other world leader has done so as of yet. So I think it's a strong indication of just how close the working relationships are. And you see that there's additional phone calls taking place that are being reported, even in addition to those meetings. The president said in the Oval Office that he does intend to visit Israel soon. We don't know if we'll be on the first trip. There's a good chance that the trip could be amended to include Israel as well. There's also a chance the president might get to Israel before that scheduled trip. We don't yet know, so I wouldn't read too much into the trip until after it happens.
A technical expert or expert technical meeting is expected to take place Saturday between the U.S. and Iran. And I want to get your take on this because there have been the meetings that have taken place about the nuclear program between the U.S. and Iran the past 2 Saturdays. Is there any indicator of how this meeting on this coming Saturday differs from what we've seen in the previous ones?
Well, it does look like the mediators are at least presenting that they are taking the negotiation seriously, and that includes Iran. When we talk about a technical meeting or experts meeting, obviously the devil is in the details of any type of agreement, and that is not good. Those details are not going to be ironed out necessarily by the top negotiators. That's where experts are going to come in, and specifically when it relates to the very complicated sanctions regime that's been put on the Iranians. It's being reported that the Iranians want to know, for various commitments that they might take with regard to the nuclear program, what type of sanctions relief that they could get. This is where it's being reported that the technical meeting is going to be focused on. There are some reports that negotiators from the two sides may have entered the same room at the end of the last round of talks, which could be an important step because until that time, what's been reported is that these are indirect negotiations with the Omani foreign minister running back and forth between the two sides, who haven't even necessarily been publicly at least willing to acknowledge that they would sit in the same room with one another.
One thing that's interesting is we did hear from several reports there by Hebrew media that the Israeli Air Force was conducting drills at some point this week, basically looking at an attack that could happen from Iran. Is there any sort of imminent threat? Is there any sort of information that's been released that Iran could once again attack Israel? I know that's always a possibility, but is there maybe some intelligence that makes it seem as though that could happen today, tomorrow, in the coming days?
It doesn't seem right now that there's intelligence that Iran is willing to strike Israel and provoke an escalation in this conflict. And I think that that would certainly undermine any possibilities that they would have to avoid a military confrontation with Israel and the United States. That would be guaranteeing a military confrontation at this point. I don't think Israel would be willing to be withheld, restrained the way they were under the Biden administration. It would be all out war, and it would be the immediate end of Iran's nuclear program and possibly the end of the Iranian regime if Iran was to attack now. But certainly, with regard to any kind of negotiations, the only way that negotiations could succeed in seeing the peaceful dismantlement of the Iranian nuclear program is if those negotiations are backed by a credible military threat. And so I think when you see Israel taking war simulations or practice runs, it indicates that if the negotiations do not go the way Israel would accept, that they could meet the long arm of the Israeli Air Force.
Before I brought you in, I talked briefly about the situation with the reports developing that Qatari and Egyptian officials there have presented a new ceasefire proposal, a framework, over to the Hamas terror group. This would, of course, be about that ceasefire that could be agreed upon at some point between Israel and Hamas. What do we know about that potential framework that is out there now? I'm sure a lot of the information is being kept behind closed doors, very close to the chest. But what do we know?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that they are talking about a negotiations, which is not for any longer a short-term temporary ceasefire or for return of some of the hostages, but rather for a return of all of the hostages and a long-term ceasefire. So this is certainly more in line with what Israel has been proposing for many months now. But the question is going to be, will Hamas agree to completely disarm itself and also to no longer be the political force in the Strip, and also who will be the political force in the Strip? At this point, I think that Israel's not necessarily willing to trust that some other Palestinian group, whether that's the Palestinian Authority or anybody else, could come in and govern the Strip. Israel believes that they're the only ones that can guarantee the security of the Strip in the long term, and that there needs to be some kind of international actors there to guarantee that any funding that comes in to rebuild the Strip does not go to rebuild terrorist infrastructure.
Before I let you go, I wanted to ask a question about Ben Gvir because he's over in, I believe he was in Florida, possibly yesterday. I know he's in the U.S. for a trip, and I wanted to get your take as to whether this is a political trip, if it's just a random trip that is happening here, or what maybe the goal is there.
Well, Ben Gvir is the Minister of National Security here, who's in charge of the police force, and he's going on a trip to meet professionals, policy professionals, both on the local level and on the national level, to learn more about policing techniques, figuring out if the Israeli police is operating in accordance with norms in other democracies. Ben Gvir was a bit of an outsider who was coming in to sort of reform the police. However, under the previous administration and the Biden administration, he really wasn't going to be welcomed with open arms. And so it's only now that President Trump is in office and you have a conservative administration in the United States that they're much more willing to accept a visit from Ben Gvir, who's been pegged as one of the more controversial politicians in Israel.
All right, Alex Traiman, as always, thank you so much for joining me. And one more question I just thought of when you were talking about that. What is the relationship like between Netanyahu and Ben Gvir? Are they on the same side here? What is that relationship overall?
Well, the Israeli politics are contentious always, and I would say that there's a lot of politicians that might not be best friends with their coalition partners. But for Netanyahu and for Ben Gvir, the relationship is an important one. Ben Gvir had taken his party out of the government when Prime Minister Netanyahu declared a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. Ben Gvir has believed that what the prime minister has said about total victory is very important, and that the only way to guarantee that on October 7th doesn't happen again is to continue the military pressure until Hamas completely leaves the Strip and is disarmed militarily. His rejoining the government at the end of the ceasefire really strengthened Netanyahu's coalition significantly, and the government is now a very broad right-wing majority coalition, and that helps Netanyahu in his bid to affect policy in Israel and to demonstrate both to the domestic audience as well as the international community that he does have a significant and a strong mandate to keep leading the country.
All right. Alex Traiman, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and help discuss all of this further. Anything else you want to add? Anything I left out before I let you go?
Well, I think it's important to note in the negotiations between the United States and Iran that it's been reported that Ron Dermer, who is Israel's Minister of Strategic Affairs, was actually staying in the hotel in Rome during the process of these negotiations. So while the negotiations are taking place between the United States and Iran, it gives further indication and confirmation of the question you asked me regarding Trump saying that Israel and the United States are on the same page on every issue, specifically when it comes to the negotiations with Iran. Both Israel and the United States are working very, very closely together to make sure that any negotiated outcome is an outcome that Israel is willing to live with.
All right. Alex Traiman, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And I do want to get you to the latest here on